Is anything too hard for God? Well, if you're a believer, your mind says, well, no, right? You've read enough Bible on that, read enough Bible stories of how God's done the impossible, maybe even memorized some Bible passages like nothing is impossible for God. But sometimes it's kind of hard for your emotions to agree with that truth. Sometimes your life is so faith-stretching that your emotions are fairly screaming, well, maybe in this case it is impossible, even for God, especially if you're still waiting for answers and you've been praying and praying and praying intensely for a really long time. I kind of think that that's where Abraham and Sarah were as we turn the page in their story to Genesis chapter 18. It's been 24 years since they left everything to follow God. 24 years. And God's promise it's still out there. And God's repeated that promise several different times. Just in the last chapter, chapter 17, which is not too long before this chapter, God's come and repeated it to Abraham again, but still it's 24 years and counting. And still no permanent home, still no land, still no nation, still no son together. And at this point, after all these years and all these repeated promises, yet still unfulfilled promises, it's kind of natural, I think, for Abraham and Sarah to think, well, maybe there's some things that are too hard, even for God. And maybe you've felt something similar from time to time. Unanswered prayers kind of have a way of taking us to that place. So, if or when you're there, how do you get your head and your heart back in sync? Right? How do you get your head and heart back in sync how do you get your emotions to accept that the word of God that you've learned is actually true? And how do you keep on believing in your heart when your mind tells you, oh, this is an impossible situation. Things are never going to work out. Well, let's turn to Genesis chapter 18 and see what we can learn from Abraham and Sarah's story to help us with ours.
The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oak trees belonging to Mamre, as he was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the hottest part of the day. Abraham looked up, and suddenly he saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran to meet them, and he bowed with his face touching the ground. "Please, sir," Abraham said, "stop by to visit me for a while. Why don't we let someone bring a little water? After you wash your feet, you can stretch out and rest under the tree. Let me bring some bread so that you can regain your strength. After that, you can leave, since this is why you stopped by to visit me." They answered, "That's fine. Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to find Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 measures of flour. Knead it and make bread." Then Abraham ran to the herd and took one of his best calves. He gave it to his servant, who prepared it quickly. Abraham took cheese and milk as well as the meat and set these in front of them. Then he stood by them under the tree as they ate. They asked him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" He answered, "Over there in the tent." The Lord said, "I promise I'll come back to you next year at this time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah happened to be listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old. Sarah was past the age of childbearing. And so Sarah laughed to herself, thinking, "Now that I've become old, will I enjoy myself again? What's more, my husband is old." The Lord asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Can I really have a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will come back to you next year at this time, and Sarah will have a son." Because she was afraid, Sarah denied that she had laughed. But the Lord said, "Yes, you did laugh."
Well, that's a really interesting encounter there between Abraham and Sarah and God. And, we could kind of get bogged down in some of the details there at the beginning. Details like, well, who are these three visitors, and why are there three of them? Did Abraham know or suspect what's going on here? Is that why Abram's so generous? Why he goes over and above in the hospitality department, having Sarah make them way more food than the four of them could eat together at one sitting? Why he goes way beyond and says, hey, get the best calf rather than just what hospitality custom at the time would require, a goat. But while that might be an interesting discussion, it kind of takes you away from the point here. The point about getting your head and your heart back in sync regarding your faith. So let's look at the part of the story that helps us with that. Again, context-wise, this is not too long after the events of chapter 17, when God told 99-year-old Abraham, you and Sarah, you're going to have a son together. All right? I promise. At which Abraham laughed. Abraham laughed because realistically, from his perspective, he and Sarah were well past the point of having any success making babies together anymore. And so Abraham asked God at that point, God, just please, remember, we've already helped you along here. I have a son. His name is Ishmael. Why don't you say he can be my heir, and we'll call it good. We'll say that took care of the promise. But God says, no, my promise is for you and for Sarah. You two are going to have a son together. And now God shows up again. And he repeats the same promise. Probably because God knows that Abraham, well, he needs to hear it. And this time, finally this time, it's not some sort of an indefinite, hey, sometime in the future you're going to have a child, but this time there's a specific time frame for the promise being fulfilled. Okay, I'm reading at verse 10. The Lord said, I promise I'll come back to you next year at this time, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son. And this time, Sarah laughs. She overhears the conversation, and she laughs too when she heard the promise this time. And you can almost hear in that as it's like the mocking laughter of a bitter old woman for whom nothing has gone according to plan. See, for this promise to come true, Sarah's going to need a miracle. They've done okay for themselves over the past 24 years, but they still don't have a child. And now the narrator of the story tells us why both Abraham and Sarah are so skeptical. Verse 11, Abraham and Sarah were old. Now here's the key point. Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Okay, which means as good as the promise was, and as much as Abraham and Sarah hoped for it and prayed that it would come true and wanted to believe it was going to come true, now it looks as if time has passed them by. Right? And what had been their greatest hope is now something impossible for even God to do something about, because you can't change biology, can you? Any places in your life where you find yourself kind of thinking a similar sort of thing? Places in your life where you wish you could believe that the words of God were true, but you don't see how they can be, given your current situation? Before we go on in this conversation, take a few minutes to stop and think about that. Ask yourself, where do you find yourself struggling to believe that God's promises can and will come true for you? And then ask yourself, well, where have you been waiting for a miracle? Where have you been waiting for a miracle, either for yourself or for your church? Hit pause and think about that before going on in this conversation. So Abram laughed when God came to him at 99 and said, "Yep, Abram, my promise, it's going to come true. You and Sarah are going to have a child, and you're going to have it together." And Sarah laughed too, because I don't think she believed much in miracles anymore, not after 24 years of not having one. And at this point, that's what it's going to take for her to have a child, a miracle. But again, even our faithlessness doesn't cancel God's faithfulness. Right? So once again, God repeats the promise. And God repeats the promise because he wants us to believe. And as we've seen, our faith and our obedience, they follow God's promises. So here's what God says, verse 13 and 14. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year," that's the promise, "and Sarah will have a son." Let's look at that question for a minute. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I mean, God's question there is designed to shift the focus. To shift the focus from their hopeless situation and limited resources to God's limitless ability and infinite resources. I mean, here's what God wants them to focus on. Not what they can't do, but what God, the maker of heaven and earth, can do. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I mean, God's saying, well, yeah, you're right. This is too hard for you. But it's not too hard for me. God's saying, not now when this happens, you won't be able to claim credit for what happens. Now all you'll see is my power and my miracles. Now all you'll see is that all of this is by my grace, that you didn't do anything to get it at all. And now you're going to have to give me all the glory and honor and praise for what ends up happening when I do exactly what I've promised. That's what's behind this "is anything too hard for the Lord" refocus question. And, I think I've needed to learn that too. Especially when I think about our church. I've had some of those same sort of conversations with God. Some conversations about how, like Abraham, our church left stability and security to follow God at his leading and his direction for his mission, and how we've experienced his blessings over the years. But we're also finding ourselves in some what looks like impossible situations for which there really don't seem to be any good solutions. And that's frankly really kind of faith stretching. But maybe that's part of the point and the lesson. All right, that if and when God does a miracle, it's all Him. It's all Him. All His power, all His grace, not our strength, our effort, our ingenuity. So if and when the miracle happens for us here at Concordia, then God gets all the glory, all the credit, all the praise for what happens, rather than us claiming credit for ourselves. Perhaps that's why God made Abraham and Sarah wait for 24 years. Now it's impossible for them to say, "I did this." Now, if it happens, there is no other explanation than miracle. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Well, apparently not, because what God said would happen did happen exactly when he said that it would. You jump ahead to chapter 21 in Genesis and you read this. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And there you have it. God's promise came true, just like he said. Well, so what does this part of Abraham's story tell us about God? A child that should not have been able to be conceived was. God overruled biology in order to keep his promise. Right on time, right on his time. And that certainly shows us that nothing is impossible for God. And that our God is able to do anything. And that our God always keeps his promises. Is anything too hard for the Lord? No. And that becomes a really important truth to hold on to, doesn't it? Especially when you're in places where you're believing in God, but life is a little challenging. And you have more questions than answers. And you're doing a lot of waiting. Or maybe your direction doesn't seem very clear anymore. Or you're dealing with some sort of a disaster. Or perhaps you're in a place emotionally that can only be described as discombobulation, where you're all kind of frazzled and frustrated all the time, and the things that you're trying to change and that need to change aren't changing, and you're confused, and you're having a hard time figuring out what God's up to. And like Abraham, you're following God and you're walking his path, but things are hard and they're difficult and they're not what you expected. And these promised blessings are sure taking a long time, and your heart and your mind just aren't syncing up there with your faith. And perhaps like Abraham and Sarah, God's promises, they just kind of make you laugh like you don't think they could possibly come true. What do you do then? What did God come to Abraham and have him do? Refocus. Right? Refocus. Ask yourself the same question as God asked Abraham. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Some things are too hard for us, but are they really too hard for God? Let's try this little illustration together. I want you to to hold up your hand, kind of like this, and then take your middle finger and just bend it underneath, all right? And then pick up your index finger, pick up your little finger, pinky finger. Now try to pick up your ring finger, right? You just can't do it. It's impossible. But now what if someone else came along and helped you? Right? Take your other hand here and just what? You can pick up. You can't do it yourself, but somebody else could come and pick up that finger for you. So what's impossible for you is not impossible if someone's there to help you. And maybe that's the point God's making there. Since nothing's impossible for God, And since nothing's too hard for him to do, since nothing is beyond his capability, God can do for us what we can't do for ourselves. God lifts the load. God lifts the load and helps us make it through the seemingly impossible situations. And if you notice how God did it for Abraham, it's remarkably similar to how God does it for us. God just kept reminding Abraham of who he was and what he'd done and what he was able to do. And then God kept drawing Abraham back to his word and reminded Abraham again of the promises he'd made to him. And that's what helps us work our way through the fog and the questions and the discombobulations of life. It's the word and the promises and the perspective of God. Right? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I mean, even when you're in a seemingly impossible spot and your faith is a little weak and your emotions in your mind aren't syncing up and you find yourself laughing at God and his ability to fulfill his promises, the answer is no. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. And both his word and his track record, well, they remind us of that. And I think that's why God said, name the child Isaac. Laughter. Right? Not primarily for the laughter there of both Abraham and Sarah, who thought, this is never going to happen. I'm way too old. God can't do this. But perhaps at a much deeper level, for the chuckle of God, for the laughter of God at our reactions to what's in front of us. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Isaac. Laughter. God chuckles. He laughs at our lack of faith. Have you forgotten who I am? God says. Have you forgotten how I've always kept my word and my promises? Have you forgotten that my promises always come true? Have you forgotten what those promises are? Have you forgotten how deeply, deeply I love you? Isaac. Laughter. I think there too, God wants us to look back and laugh ourselves and chuckle at how could we have ever doubted him? Isaac. Laughter. Laughter for the power of God to change our skepticism into joy. Kind of a deep, belly-aching, boisterous laugh. And Isaac. Laughter. God's own great, tremendous joy in keeping his promise. In keeping his promise when it seems like he can't or won't. Laughter. And not just here in this story. God's laughter also as a hint of his joy when his eternal rescue plan is going to all come together. You see, Isaac isn't the only miracle child here. There's another one that's coming. Far, far in the future, God kept a promise that he first made way, way back in the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve after they'd messed up their relationship with him for themselves and for everybody else. God made a promise that he himself would send a rescuer, that he would do what they couldn't do to fix the broken relationship. And you know what? Many, many, many years after Isaac, another child was born. This time to a virgin, right? And that's even more impossible. But God made it happen anyway, because nothing is too hard for the Lord. Nothing is impossible with God. And so God came to us. And Jesus was born to a virgin named Mary. And Jesus would do the thing that we needed most because we couldn't make it happen on our own. Remember, there's never enough rungs in the ladder to climb up to heaven. So Jesus comes to reconnect us to God. He comes to reconnect us to God by taking our sin and our shame on himself and carrying it to a cross. And then even though he died, well, Jesus didn't stay dead. And that too, that's impossible. But it happened. Is anything too hard for the Lord? All the promises of God find their yes in Jesus. And when you're struggling to believe that, what I would invite you to do as you think about this part of Abraham's story is just to lean into God's laughter there and to press on and to push through, trusting that God who's been there and who's done it before, that he's going to do it again, and that he can and will keep his promises. You've seen it. Isaac was born right on time in God's perfect timing, and so was Jesus, and God laughs. God chuckles. God smiles at keeping his promises. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Nope. Not even when we laugh and cry because we think it's over. Well, when we laugh and cry because we think it's over, it's not. And when it's hard for us to see that, and when success and blessing isn't as fast or as quick or as timely as we think it should be, God invites us to remember who he is. Not only the God who loves us and who loves us with everything that he has, but the God who's with us every step of the way. The God who keeps his promises all the time, even when it looks like he can't. The God who does the impossible. The God who can do anything and has done it over and over and over again. The God who laughs at the seemingly impossible. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Don't give up or give in. Just keep pressing on and pushing through as you lean into the promises and as you lean into the laughter of God. And you know what? As you do that, you just might find a little laughter for yourself.